This is a continuation of The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli, comprising chapters 10 to 15. Chapter 10: How the Strength of All States Should Be Measured. In examining the character of these principalities, it is necessary to consider another point, namely whether the prince has such a position as to be able in case of need to maintain himself alone, or whether he has always need of the protection of others. The better to explain this, I would say, that I consider those capable of maintaining themselves alone, who can, through abundance of men or money, put together a sufficient army and hold the field against anyone who assails them. And I consider to have need of others, those who cannot take the field against their enemies, but are obliged to take refuge within their walls and stand on the defensive. We have already discussed the former case and will speak in future of it as occasion arises. In the second case, there is nothing to be said except to encourage such a prince to provision and fortify his own town, and not to trouble about the country. And whoever has strongly fortified his town, and, as regards the government of his subjects, has proceeded as we have already described and will further relate, will be attacked with great reluctance, for men are always averse to enterprises in which they foresee difficulties, and it can never appear easy to attack one who has his town well guarded and is not hated by the people. The cities of Germany are extremely liberal, have little surrounding country, and obey the emperor when they choose, and they do not fear him or any other potentate that they have about them. They are fortified in such a manner that everyone thinks that to reduce them would be tedious and difficult, for they all have the necessary moats and bastions, sufficient artillery, and always keep in the public storehouses food and drink and fuel for 1 year. Beyond which, to keep the lower classes satisfied and without loss to the public, they have always enough means to give them work for 1 year in these employments which form the nerve and life of the town, and in the industries by which the lower classes live. Military exercises are still held in reputation, and many regulations are enforced for maintaining them. A prince, therefore, who possesses a strong city and does not make himself hated, cannot be assaulted. And if he were to be so, the assailant would be obliged to retire shamefully. For so many things change that it is almost impossible for anyone to hold the field for a year with his armies idle. And to those who urge that the people, having their possessions outside and seeing them burnt, will not have patience, and the long siege and self-interest will make them forget their prince, I reply that a powerful and courageous prince will always overcome those difficulties by now raising the hopes of his subjects that the evils will not last long, now impressing them with fear of the enemy's cruelty, now by dexterously assuring himself of those who appear too bold. Besides which, the enemy would naturally burn and ruin the country on first arriving, and in the time when men's minds are still hot and eager to defend themselves, and therefore the prince has still less to fear, for after some days, when people have cooled down, the damage is done, the evil has been suffered, and there is no remedy, so that they are the more ready to unite with their prince, as it appears that he is under an obligation to them, their houses having been burnt and their possessions ruined in his defense. It is the nature of men to be as much bound by the benefits that they confer as by those they receive. From which it follows that, everything considered, a prudent prince will not find it difficult to uphold the courage of his subjects both at the commencement and during a state of the siege, if he possesses provisions and means to defend himself. Chapter 11: Of Ecclesiastical Principalities. It now remains to us only to speak of ecclesiastical principalities, with regard to which the difficulties lie wholly before they are possessed. They are acquired either by ability or by fortune, but are maintained without either, for they are sustained by the ancient religious customs, which are so powerful and of such quality that they keep their princes in power in whatever manner they proceed and live. These alone have a state without defending it, have subjects without governing them, and the states not being defended are not taken from them. The subjects not being governed do not disturb themselves, and neither think of nor are capable of alienating themselves from them. Only these principalities, therefore, are secure and happy. But as they are upheld by higher causes, which the human mind cannot attain to, I will abstain from speaking of them. For being exalted and maintained by God, it would be the work of a presumptuous and foolish man to discuss them. However, I might be asked how it has come about that the Church has reached such great temporal power when, previous to Alexander VI, the Italian potentates, and not merely the really powerful ones, but every lord or baron, however insignificant, held it in slight esteem as regards temporal power, whereas now it is dreaded by a king of France, whom it has been able to drive out of Italy, and has also been able to ruin the Venetians. Therefore, although this is well known, I do not think it superfluous to call it to mind. Before Charles, King of France, came into Italy, this country was under the rule of the Pope, the Venetians, the King of Naples, the Duke of Milan, and the Florentines. These potentates had to have two chief cares: one, that no foreigner should enter Italy by force of arms; the other, that none of the existing governments should extend its dominions. Those chiefly to be watched were the Pope and the Venetians. To keep back the Venetians required the ruin of all the others, as in the defense of Ferrara, and to keep down the Pope they made use of the Roman barons. These were divided into two factions, the Orsinis and the Colonnas, and as there was constant quarreling between them, and they were constantly under arms, before the eyes of the Pope, they kept the papacy weak and infirm. And although there arose now and then a resolute Pope like Sextus, yet his fortune or ability was never able to liberate him from these evils. The shortness of their life was the reason of this, for in the course of 10 years, which as a general rule a pope lived, he had great difficulty in suppressing even one of the factions, and if, for example, a pope had almost put down the Colonnas, a new pope would succeed who was hostile to the Orsinis, which caused the Colonnas to spring up again, and he was not in time to suppress them. This caused the temporal power of the Pope to be of little esteem in Italy. Then arose Alexander VI, who of all the pontiffs who have ever reigned, best showed how a pope might prevail both by money and by force, with Duke Valentine as his instrument, and, on the occasion of the French invasion, he did all that I have previously described in speaking of the actions of the Duke. And although his object was to aggrandize not the Church but the Duke, what he did resulted in the aggrandizement of the Church, which after the death of the Duke became the heir of his labors. Then came Pope Julius, who found the Church powerful, possessing all Romagna, all the Roman barons suppressed, and the factions destroyed by the severity of Alexander. He also found the way open for accumulating wealth in ways never used before the time of Alexander. These measures were not only followed by Julius, but increased. He resolved to gain Bologna, put down the Venetians and drive the French from Italy, in all which enterprises he was successful. He merits the greater praise, as he did everything to increase the power of the Church and not of any private person. He also kept the Orsini and Colonna parties in the conditions in which he found them, and although there were some leaders among them who might have made changes, there were two things that kept them steady. One, the greatness of the Church, which they dreaded. The other, the fact that they had no cardinals, who are the origin of the tumults among them. For these parties are never at rest when they have cardinals, for these stir up the parties both within Rome and outside, and the barons are forced to defend them. Thus from the ambitions of prelates arise the discords and tumults among the barons. His Holiness, Pope Leo X, therefore, has found the pontificate in a very powerful condition, from which it is hoped that as those popes made it great by force of armies, so he, through his goodness and infinite other virtues, will make it both great and venerated. Chapter 12. The different kinds of militia and mercenary soldiers. Having now discussed fully the qualities of these principalities of which I propose to treat, and partially considered the causes of their prosperity or failure, and having also showed the methods by which many have sought to obtain such states, it now remains for me to treat generally of the methods of attack and defense that can be used in each of them. We have said already how necessary it is for a prince to have his foundations good, otherwise he is certain to be ruined. The chief foundations of all states, whether new, old, or mixed, are good laws and good arms. And as there cannot be good laws where there are not good arms, and where there are good arms there should be good laws, I will not now discuss the laws, but will speak of the arms. I say, therefore, that the arms by which a prince defends his possessions are either his own, or else mercenaries or auxiliaries or mixed. The mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous, and if anyone keeps his state based on the arms of mercenaries, he will never stand firm or sure, as they are disunited, ambitious without discipline, faithless, bold amongst friends, cowardly amongst enemies. They have no fear of God and keep no faith with men. Ruin is only deferred as long as the assault is postponed. In peace you are despoiled by them, and in war by the enemy. The cause of this is that they have no love or other motive to keep them in the field beyond a trifling wage, which is not enough to make them ready to die for you. They are quite willing to be your soldiers, so long as you do not make war, but when war comes, it is either fly or be off. I ought to have little trouble in proving this, since the ruin of Italy is now caused by nothing else but through her having relied for many years on mercenary arms. These were somewhat improved in a few cases, and appeared courageous among themselves. But when the foreigner came, they showed their worthlessness. Thus it came about that King Charles of France was allowed to take Italy without the slightest trouble, and those who said that it was owing to our sins spoke the truth. But it was not the sins that they believed, but those that I have related. And as it was the sins of princes, they too have suffered the punishment. I will explain more fully the defects of these arms. Mercenary captains are either very capable men or not. If they are, you cannot rely upon them, for they will always aspire to their own greatness, either by oppressing you, their master, or by oppressing others against your intentions. But if the captain is not an able man, he will generally ruin you. And if it is replied to this, that whoever has armed forces will do the same. Whether these are mercenary or not, I would reply that as armies are to be used either by a prince or by a republic, the prince must go in person to take the position of captain, and the republic must send its own citizens. If the one sent turns out incompetent, it must change him, and if capable, keep him by law from going beyond the proper limits. And it is seen by experience that only princes and armed republics make very great progress, whereas mercenary forces do nothing but damage. And also an armed republic submits less easily to the rule of one of its citizens than a republic armed by foreign forces. Rome and Sparta were for many centuries well-armed and free. The Swiss are well-armed and enjoy great freedom. As an example of mercenary armies in antiquity, there are the Carthaginians, who were oppressed by their mercenary soldiers after the termination of the first war with the Romans, even while they still had their own citizens as captains. Philip of Macedon was made captain of their forces by the Thebans after the death of Epaminondas, and after gaining the victory, he deprived them of liberty. The Milanese, on the death of Duke Philip, hired Francesco Sforza against the Venetians, who, having overcome the enemy at Caravaggio, allied himself with them to oppress the Milanese, his employers. The father of this Sforza, being a soldier in the service of the Queen Giovanna of Naples, left her suddenly unarmed, by which she was compelled, in order not to lose the kingdom, to throw herself into the arms of the King of Aragon. And if the Venetians and Florentines have in times past increased their dominions by means of such forces, and their captains have not made themselves princes, but have defended them, I reply that the Florentines in this case have been favored by chance. For of the capable leaders whom they might have feared, some did not conquer, some met with opposition, and others directed their ambition elsewhere. The one who did not conquer was Sir John Hawkwood, whose fidelity could not be known as he was not victorious, but everyone will admit that, had he conquered, the Florentines would have been at his mercy. Sforza had always the Bracceschi against him, they being constantly at enmity. Francesco directed his ambition towards Lombardy, Braccio against the church in the kingdom of Naples. But let us look at what followed a short time ago. The Florentines appointed Paolo Vitelli their captain, a man of great prudence, who had risen from a private station to the highest reputation. If he had taken Pisa, no one can deny that it was highly important for the Florentines to retain his friendship, because had he become the soldier of their enemies, they would have had no means of opposing him, and in order to retain him, they would have been obliged to obey him. As to the Venetians, if one considers the progress they made, it will be seen that they acted surely and gloriously so long as they made war with their own forces, that it was before they commenced their enterprises on land that they fought courageously with their own gentlemen in armed populace. But when they began to fight on land, they abandoned this virtue and began to follow the Italian custom. And at the commencement of their land conquests, they had not much to fear from their captains, their land possessions not being very large, and their reputation being great. But as their possessions increased, as they did under Carmangala, they had an example of their mistake. For seeing that he was very powerful, after he had defeated the Duke of Milan, and knowing, on the other hand, that he was not enterprising in warfare, they considered that they would not make any more conquests with him, and they neither would nor could dismiss him, for fear of losing what they had already gained. They were therefore obliged, in order to make sure of him, to have him killed. They then had for captains Bartolomeo da Bergamo, Roberto da San Severino, Count di Pitigliano, and such like, from whom they had to fear loss instead of gain, as happened subsequently at Vela, where in one day they lost what they had laboriously gained in 800 years. For with these forces only slow and trifling acquisitions are made, but sudden and miraculous losses. And as I have cited these examples from Italy, which has now for many years been governed by mercenary forces, I will now deal more largely with them, so that, having seen their origin and progress, they can be better remedied. You must understand that in these latter times, as soon as the empire began to be repudiated in Italy, and the Pope to gain greater reputation in temporal matters, Italy was divided into many states. Many of the principal cities took up arms against their nobles, who, favored by the emperor, had held them in subjection, and the church encouraged this in order to increase its temporal power. In many other cities, one of the inhabitants became prince. Thus, Italy having fallen almost entirely into the hands of the church and a few republics, and the priests and other citizens not being accustomed to bear arms, they began to hire foreigners as soldiers. The first to bring reputation for this kind of militia was Alberigo da Como, a native of Romagna. The discipline of this man produced, among others, Braccio and Sforza, who were in their day the arbiters of Italy. After these came all those others who up to the present day have commanded the armies of Italy, and the result of their prowess has been that Italy has been overrun by Charles, preyed on by Louis, tyrannized over by Ferrando, and insulted by the Swiss. The system adopted by them was, in the first place, to increase their own reputation by discrediting the infantry. They did this because, as they had no country and lived on their earnings, a few foot soldiers did not augment their reputation, and they could not maintain a large number, and therefore they restricted themselves almost entirely to cavalry, by which, with a smaller number, they were well paid and honored. They reduced things to such a state that in an army of 20,000 soldiers, there were not 2,000 foot. They had also used every means to spare themselves and the soldiers any hardship or fear by not killing each other in their encounters, but taking prisoners without a blow. They made no attacks on fortifications by night, and those in the fortifications did not attack the tents at night. They made no stockades on ditches round their camps, and did not take the field in winter. All these things were permitted by their military rules, and adopted, as we have said, to avoid trouble and danger, so that they have reduced Italy to slavery and degradation. Chapter 13. Of auxiliary, mixed, and native troops. Auxiliary forces, which are the other kind of useless forces, are when one calls on a potentate to come and aid one with his troops, as was done in recent times by Julius, who, seeing the wretched failure of his mercenary forces in his Ferrara enterprise, had recourse to auxiliaries and arranged with Ferrando, king of Spain, that he should help him with his armies. These forces may be good in themselves, but they are always dangerous for those who borrow them. For if they lose, you are defeated, and if they conquer, you remain their prisoner. And although ancient history is full of examples of this, I will not depart from the example of Pope Julius II, which is still fresh. Nothing could be less prudent than the course he adopted, for wishing to take Ferrara, he put himself entirely into the power of a foreigner. But by good fortune there arose a third cause which prevented him reaping the effects of his bad choice. For when his auxiliaries were beaten at Ravenna, the Swiss rose up and drove back the victors, against all expectation of himself or others, so that he was not taken prisoner by the enemy which had fled, nor by his own auxiliaries having conquered by other arms than theirs. The Florentines, being totally disarmed, hired 10,000 Frenchmen to attack Pisa, by which measure they ran greater risk than at any period of their struggles. The Emperor of Constantinople, to oppose his neighbors, put 10,000 Turks into Greece, who after the war would not go away again, which was the beginning of the servitude of Greece to the infidels. Anyone, therefore, who wishes not to conquer would do well to use these forces, which are much more dangerous than mercenaries. As with them, ruin is complete, for they are all united in obedience to others. Whereas with mercenaries, when they have conquered, it requires more time and a good opportunity for them to injure you, as they do not form a single body and have been engaged and paid by you. Therefore, a third party that you have made leader cannot at once acquire enough authority to be able to injure you. In a word, the greatest dangers with mercenaries lies in their cowardice and reluctance to fight. But with auxiliaries, the danger lies in their courage. A wise prince, therefore, always avoids these forces and has recourse to his own, and would prefer rather to lose with his own men than conquer with the forces of others, not deeming it a true victory which is gained by foreign arms. I never hesitate to cite the example of Cesare Borgia and his actions. This duke entered Romagna with auxiliary troops, leading forces composed entirely of French soldiers, and with these he took Imola and Forli. But as they seemed unsafe, he had recourse to mercenaries and hired the Orsini and Vitelli. Afterwards, finding these uncertain to handle, unfaithful and dangerous, he suppressed them and relied upon his own men. And the difference between these forces can be easily seen if one considers the difference between the reputation of the Duke when he had only the French, when he had the Orsini and Vitelli, and when he had to rely on himself and his own soldiers. His reputation will be found to have constantly increased, and he was never so highly esteemed as when everyone saw that he was the sole master of his forces. I do not wish to go away from recent Italian instances, but I cannot omit Hero of Syracuse, whom I have already mentioned. This man being, as I said, made head of the army by the Syracusans, immediately recognized the uselessness of that mercenary militia, which was composed like our Italian mercenary troops, and as he thought it unsafe either to retain them or dismiss them, he had them cut in pieces and thenceforward made war with his own arms and not those of others. I would also call to mind a figure out of the Old Testament which well illustrates this point. When David offered to Saul to go and fight with the Philistine champion Goliath, Saul, to encourage him, armed him with his own arms, which when David had tried on, he refused, saying that with them he could not fight so well. He preferred, therefore, to face the enemy with his own sling and knife. In short, the arms of others either fall away from you, or overburden you, or else impede you. Charles VIII, father of King Louis XL, having through good fortune and bravery liberated France from the English, recognized this necessity of being armed with his own forces, and established in his kingdom a system of men-at-arms and infantry. Afterwards, King Louis his son abolished the infantry and began to hire Swiss, which mistake being followed by others is, as may now be seen, a cause of danger to that kingdom. For by giving such reputation to the Swiss, France has disheartened all her own troops, the infantry having been abolished and the men-at-arms being obliged to foreigners for assistance. For being accustomed to fight with Swiss troops, they think they cannot conquer without them. Whence it comes that the French are insufficiently strong to oppose the Swiss, and without the aid of the Swiss they will not venture against others. The armies of the French are thus of a mixed kind, partly mercenary and partly her own. Taken together, they are much better than troops entirely composed of mercenaries or auxiliaries, but much inferior to national forces. I do not wish to go away from recent Italian instances, but I cannot omit Hero of Syracuse, whom I have already mentioned. This man being, as I said, made head of the army by the Syracusans, immediately recognized the uselessness of that mercenary militia, which was composed like our Italian mercenary troops, and as he thought it unsafe either to retain them or dismiss them, he had them cut in pieces and thenceforward made war with his own arms and not those of others. I would also call to mind a figure out of the Old Testament which well illustrates this point. When David offered to Saul to go and fight with the Philistine champion Goliath, Saul, to encourage him, armed him with his own arms, which when David had tried on he refused, saying that with them he could not fight so well. He preferred, therefore, to face the enemy with his own sling and knife. In short, the arms of others either fall away from you, or overburden you, or else impeded you. Charles VIII, father of King Louis XIV, having through good fortune and bravery liberated France from the English, recognized the necessity of being armed with his own forces and established in his kingdom a system of men-at-arms and infantry. Afterwards, King Louis, his son, abolished the infantry and began to hire Swiss, which mistake it being followed by others is, as may now be seen, a cause of danger to that kingdom. For by giving such reputation to the Swiss, France has disheartened all her own troops, the infantry having been abolished and the men-at-arms being obliged to foreigners for assistance. For being accustomed to fight with Swiss troops, they think they cannot conquer without them. Whence it comes that the French are insufficiently strong to oppose the Swiss, and without the aid of the Swiss they will not venture against others. The armies of the French are thus of a mixed kind, partly mercenary and partly her own. Taken together, they are much better than troops entirely composed of mercenaries or auxiliaries, but much inferior to national forces. Chapter 14. What the duties of a prince are with regard to the militia. A prince should therefore have no other aim or thought, nor take up any other thing for his study, but war and its order and discipline. For that is the only art that is necessary to one who commands, and it is of such virtue that it not only maintains those who are born princes, but often enables men of private fortune to attain to that rank. And one sees, on the other hand, that when princes think more of luxury than of arms, they lose their state. The chief cause which makes anyone lose it is the contempt of this art, and the way to acquire it is to be well versed in the same. Francesco Sforza, through being well armed, became, from a private position, Duke of Milan. His sons, through wishing to avoid the fatigue and hardship of war, from dukes became private persons. For among other evils caused by being disarmed, it renders you contemptible, which is one of those disgraceful things which a prince must guard against, as will be explained later. Because there is no comparison whatever between an armed man and a disarmed one, it is not reasonable to suppose that one who is armed will obey willingly one who is unarmed, or that any unarmed man will remain safe among armed servants. For one being disdainful and the other suspicious, it is not possible for them to act well together. And yet a prince who is ignorant of military matters, besides the other misfortunes already mentioned, cannot be esteemed by his soldiers, nor have confidence in them. He ought therefore never to let his thoughts stray from the exercise of war, and in peace he ought to practice it more than in war, which he can do in two ways, both by action and by study. As to action, he must, besides keeping his men well disciplined and exercised, engage continually in hunting, and thus accustom his body to hardships. And on the other hand, learn the nature of the land, how the mountains rise, how the valleys are disposed, where the plains lie, and understand the nature of the rivers and swamps, and to this he should devote great attention. This knowledge is useful in two ways. In the first place, one learns to know one's country and can the better see how to defend it. Then by means of the knowledge and experience gained in one locality, one can easily understand any other that it may be necessary to venture on. For the hills and valleys, plains and rivers of Tuscany, for instance, have a certain resemblance to those of other provinces, so that from a knowledge of the country in one province, one can easily arrive at a knowledge of others. And that prince who is lacking in this skill is wanting in the first essentials of a leader, for it is this which teaches how to find the enemy, take up quarters, lead armies, arrange marches, and occupy positions with advantage. Philopoemen, prince of the Achaea, among other praises bestowed on him by writers, is lauded because in times of peace he thought of nothing but the methods of warfare. And when he was in the country with his friends, he often stopped and asked them, "If the enemy were on that hill, and we found ourselves here with our army, which of us would have the advantage? How could we safely approach him maintaining our order? If we wished to retire, what ought we to do? If they retired, how should we follow them?" And he put before them as they went along all the cases that might happen to an army, heard their opinion, gave his own, fortifying it by argument, so that through these continued cogitations there could never happen any incident when leading his armies for which he was not prepared. But as to exercise for the mind, The prince ought to read history and study the actions of eminent men, see how they acted in warfare, examine the causes of their victories and losses in order to imitate the former and avoid the latter, and above all, do as some eminent men have done in the past, who have imitated someone who has been much praised and glorified, and have always kept their deeds and actions before them. As they say, Alexander the Great imitated Achilles, Caesar Alexander, and Scipio Cyrus. And whoever reads the life of Cyrus, written by Xenophon, will perceive in the life of Scipio how gloriously he imitated him, and how, in chastity, affability, humanity, and liberality, Scipio conformed to those qualities of Cyrus described by Xenophon. A wise prince should follow similar methods and never remain idle in peaceful times, but by industry make such good use of the time as may serve him in adversity, so that when fortune changes, she may find him prepared to resist her blows. Chapter 15. Of the things for which men, and especially princes, are praised or blamed. It remains now to be seen what are the methods and rules for a prince as regards his subjects and friends. And as I know that many have written of this, I fear that my writing about it may be deemed presumptuous, differing as I do, especially in this matter from the opinions of others. But my intention being to write something of use to those who understand it, it appears to me more proper to go to the real truth of the matter than to its imagination. And many have imagined republics and principalities which have never been seen or known to exist in reality. For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live, that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation. A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good. Therefore, it is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain himself to learn how not to be good, and to use it and not use it according to the necessity of the case, leaving on one side then those things which concern only an imaginary prince. And speaking of those that are real, I state that all men, when spoken of, and especially princes who are placed at a greater height, are noted for some of those qualities which bring them either praise or blame. Thus one is considered liberal, another miserly, one a free giver, another rapacious, one cruel, another merciful, one a breaker of his word, another faithful, one effeminate and pusillanimous, another fierce and high-spirited, one humane, another proud, one lascivious, another chaste, one frank, another astute, one hard, another easy, one serious, another frivolous, one religious, another incredulous, and so on. I know that everyone will admit that it would be highly praiseworthy in a prince to possess all the above-named qualities that are reputed good, but as they can't all be possessed or observed, human conditions not permitting of it, it is necessary that he should be prudent enough to avoid the disgrace of those vices which would lose him the state, and guard himself against those which will not lose it him, if possible, but if not able to, he can indulge them with less scruple. And yet he must not mind incurring the disgrace of those vices, without which it would be difficult to save the state. For if one considers well, it will be found that some things which seem virtues would, if followed, lead to one's ruin, and some others which appear vices result, if followed, in one's greater security and well-being. This concludes the third part of 5 total of The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.